If you're a discerning, open-minded and dedicated seeker who loves a good deep dive into the nature of reality and consciousness, then do check out my book, The Grand Illusion, composed of over 10,000 hours of research and experience. Find more information and reader reviews at brendandmurphy.com/TGI. So it was revisionary theology that you termed it.
Yeah, revisionary theology. I don't know what else to call it, really. I'm revising the classical interpretation. So I'm not dependent on the classical view of theology or history whatsoever, being outside the industry. And I'm quite happy to reevaluate the texts in a fashion that makes more sense. Because as we'll go through this, the original interpretation makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because you can't find these people in the historical record. So somehow you've got to attach this story back into history. If not, if you can't do that, then it's pure mythology. And those are the two other choices. And I'm sort of treading a median path between the two and trying to put it back into history.
Cool. I like that. Well, with that, I'm going to just interject a very brief intro and I'll let you continue your line of thought there. So, ladies and gents, we are talking to Ralph Ellis. He's a researcher of 40 years plus in this realm, the realm he calls revisionary theology. And we're going to get into a few interesting subjects here. He's already touched on a couple, and I think the historical factor there that you have spent so much time with is absolutely fascinating, because as you said, if you can't connect these characters and figures back into a historical setting, then it is mythology, basically. So I think anyone who's spent that long doing that job has probably got something very interesting to say. And I found Ralph via Michael Tsarian, and I saw him speaking with Michael, and I was like, wow, this is very interesting. He's done a lot of very interesting work, and I think obviously people should hear about it. So with that said, there are a few things when Ralph asked me what we might want to talk about. I threw out, or he threw out, things like the Gospels, the Torah. I mentioned pyramid connections, Jesus, King of Edessa, and this whole tying back in the mythology into a historical setting. So, Ralph, where do we start with this?
Probably to set the stage, maybe back in the Old Testament before we run on to the New Testament, because that will set the stage a little bit, because we have the same problem in both of these ancient chronicles, in as you were just saying there, that these characters are missing from the historical record. And so we have this very detailed ancient record of these people, and virtually none of it can be tied into real history as we know it. And that's why we've had the controversy over theology for more than 100 years now, since people started actually investigating these texts in a sort of academic fashion, that none of these characters are visible in the historical record. So either this entire record is mythology, or perhaps we're looking in the wrong place, or maybe for the wrong names. Maybe they're working under pseudonyms or something like that. So you can either be a classical theist, so you can be a Christian or a Jew who just believes this story because you've got the book, so therefore you believe it, or you can be critical, and inevitably you end up as being a mythicist because you can't find these people in the historical record. Or you go down my route, which is a median sort of between the two, where I am actually finding these people in the historical record. But in order to do so, you have to be fairly broad-minded, because the story changes somewhat. It's funny, actually. I get rejected on both sides by mythicists and by theists as being a heretic. And yet my biblical history doesn't change the story almost at all. So there's a bit of a conundrum here. In my view, I've proved that historically, I'm not talking about spiritually here, I don't do that side of it, but historically, as something like 90% of the biblical story is correct. but just not in the fashion that you would expect it to be. Therefore, as a believer, you would have to change your perspective somewhat, because these characters are not who you have been taught that they were. And the classic example of this, going back into the Old Testament, we might as well start there, I suppose, is the Exodus and the Israelites. Because, as usual, we have this conundrum where they cannot be found in the historical record. Very famous event, Exodus, loads of people being thrown out of Egypt. And all of the archaeology from the region says that this never happened. That's the problem. But you know, the story was far too detailed, as far as I could see, for this just be made up. Well, I suppose maybe someone could make up a complex story, but you know, and its transmission down through the centuries, down through the millennia, it struck me that there might be a real story here if we look for it. And then I found that people like Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, I suppose you might say, he said that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. Now that changes the story. So, and that the Hyksos, if people are unaware of you know, this group of people, they were known as the shepherd kings of Egypt. They were an immigrant population into Egypt, circa something, I don't know, about 2200 BC. They took over Egypt and they ruled Lower Egypt, northern Egypt, for a number of centuries, for about 400 years or more, a little bit more than that. And they were thrown out of Egypt on a great exodus. Okay. So now we do have a story of an exodus. And Josephus Flavius, quite controversially, because no one will mention this, and this is absolutely crazy that you won't find this in any reference book. You won't really find it on Wiki. We spent 4 months, and about 36 pages of Wiki trying to put it into Wiki. And it got deleted on 15 occasions. And finally, we were kicked off Wiki for being disruptive. And all we wanted to do was put in this quote from Josephus, that he says that the Israelites, what does he say? He says that the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt were our forefathers. So we got a direct link there. But you won't find it, as I say, in most reference books, because it's just not there. It's a taboo subject. But if we run down that road, and why not, you know, let's have broad, you know, open minds and see where it goes to, we will find that there is a direct connection here. Because if we go through the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt, because they were pushed out, they ruled Lower Egypt for a number of centuries. And then they had a war with the Egyptians being the people from southern Egypt down in Thebes. They had a conflict. They had a civil war, basically, between the two. And this was caused in part by the eruption of Santorini.
Okay.
So Santorini was the island in the Mediterranean that was a big volcano, and it blew its top in 1600 BC. This was the volcano that destroyed most of Crete, really, and the Minoan Empire was severely disrupted by it. It destroyed Santorini completely, and caused havoc throughout the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the largest explosion in recorded history. Okay, so now we have something that will equate with the biblical Exodus story and the story of the plagues. So for the Hyksos Exodus, then, we have a number of things that happened. We have a group of people who were in Egypt. They were immigrants. One of their leaders was called Jacob. Now there's a clue for starters. There was a pharaoh called Jacob, Jacobah. He was a Hyksos pharaoh. They were known as shepherds. They were the shepherd kings, just like the patriarchs were all known as shepherds. And then they had the plagues. So this is from real history. There was 3 days of darkness. There was a great ash fall. I don't know if you know, but that's one of the plagues from the biblical story. The biblical story that says that God said unto Moses, take handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and throw it up into the sky, and it will become a small dust over all of the lands of Egypt. It's an ash fall. That happened in 1600 BC. That was the eruption of Santorini.
Okay. Yep.
There was a pillar of fire. There was a pillar of smoke. There was a tsunami, the waters parting and then consuming the Egyptian army. As you know, with the big Indonesian tsunami from, it's about 10 years ago or something now, isn't it? Anyway, the big Indonesian tsunami, the sea disappeared. Yeah. And people who didn't understand this phenomena were walking out along the beach, catching the fish, that were just lying there on the ground because the sea had disappeared. And if the Egyptian army had done the same, well, okay, but 10 minutes later, the sea comes back in again, doesn't it? And there goes your army.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a parting of the waters. There was a tsunami. There was a war with the Egyptians. These people, the Hyksos, they were circumcised, they wore earrings, and they wore curly side locks of hair, just like modern Judaism does. And with this conflict, some 350,000, I think it is, of these Hyksos people were thrown out of Egypt, and they went from Pyramisi to Jerusalem. And on the way, they destroyed Jericho. Okay. Now, that is the Hyksos. This is not from the Bible. This is the history, the real history as we know it, of the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt. And it happens to be exactly the same as the biblical account in everything bar the date, because of course the date of the biblical Exodus is supposed to be like 1220 BC instead of 16. Well, the Hyksos Exodus was 1580 BC. So we've got about 350 years between the two. Apart from that, it's the same. Yeah. And then the question is, do you want to accept that as being an equivalence, or do you just disregard it? And the problem is with most of, well, certainly with theology, within Judaism, it's dismissed. Within history, it's largely dismissed as well, because I don't know, they don't want to tread on the toes of the priesthood or something. I'm not sure quite why, but even within standard history, they will not make that equivalence. They will tell you the story, but they won't tell you the similarities. And yet here we have, in this story, we have about 5 black swans. Now, the black swan phenomena was named after the swans in Perth, Australia. It's something totally unexpected that you could never predict. So, from Europe, from America, we all know what a swan is. It's a big white bird that paddles around on a lake. And then you go to Perth, the only place in the world, and the swans are black. And you think, well, I would have never guessed that. And from that, we get the notion of the black swan event, something you cannot predict. Well, here in this Exodus, we have 5 things that no chronic could ever really have predicted. 3 days of darkness for no good reason. An ash fall, where did that come from? Pillar of fire, a pillar of smoke, and a tsunami, all at the same time. So this guy, whoever was writing this, managed to get 5 black swans all tied together, not knowing, unless he was actually there and watching it, not knowing that all of these events are linked to a maritime volcano eruption. you cannot get that number of similarities by accident. This has to be an eyewitness account of what happened, the eruption of Santorini. And of course, someone was going to record this. I mean, it was the biggest event in pretty much recorded history within Europe. Someone was going to note it down at some point. And it looks like the Hyksos did, because it affected them so badly.
Yeah.
And the problem in Egypt was not the fact that they had this big volcano, because they were quite a long way away from it. So, I mean, small dust, ash fall across Egypt. Well, I suppose it did affect them. If you read the works of Josephus Flavius, who also writes an account of this, he says it was so bad that many of the people were inwardly consumed by the air that was too thick to breathe. And if you've seen any pictures of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, that's exactly what you get.
Yeah.
So there's another black swan. So you've got 6 of them now. And so where was I going with this? There is an obvious direct equivalence between the two.
Yeah.
And so we can safely assume that this description, this biblical description of the plagues, followed by the Exodus, is a true account of what happened in Egypt. And the Hyksos were affected not simply because of this volcano. That's what I was saying. They were affected by the political fallout from this volcano, because the gods were angry. Why were the gods angry? Well, it was your fault. And no doubt the Egyptians down in Thebes were saying, no, it's your fault.
Yeah.
And it caused, obviously, a civil war between these two people. And in both the history and in the biblical account, it's clear that this festered for a number of years. The Bible doesn't say how long, it just festered. They kept going back to Pharaoh, and, you know, there was a to and fro between the Israelites and Pharaoh. In the historical record, it went on for about 20 years. Between Pharaoh Ahmose and Karmose. Between Karmose and Ahmose. There was about a 20-year gap between the eruption and the final exodus out of Egypt. And so the Hyksos Exodus, or the Hyksos as the Americans like to say, happened in about 1580 BC, 20 years after the eruption, and they had this enormous great exodus. And they were pushed out. Some of them, I think, went out across the Mediterranean. So they got onto boats and they disappeared to the various Mediterranean islands and populated. This is why we get so many Egyptian influences throughout the Mediterranean basin. But the majority went up on a land-based route up towards Israel, Judea, and the Levant. And on the way, they destroyed Jericho. So we have this famous event from the biblical story of the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. And this is one of the major proofs by historians and archaeologists that the biblical story is not true. It's mythical, because Jericho was destroyed 350 years before the Exodus. Yeah, it was destroyed by the Hyksos. So it's only not true if you're clinging desperately to this 1220 Ramesside date for the Exodus. If you say that it was the Hyksos Exodus, then they are directly equivalent. And of course, within the biblical record, there is no evidence really for this 1220 Ramesside date. They only say it because the Israelites left from Pi-Ramesses. And Pi-Ramesses is a Ramesside town. It belonged to Ramesses II, and therefore they identify the Exodus with Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. And that's where your 1220 odd date comes from. Yes, but Pi-Ramesses was built upon Avaris, and Avaris was the capital city of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. And that's where they went from. So they both went from the same city, it just had a different name. when these texts were being written down.
Yeah.
It's like someone mentioning York in Britain as being the place where something happened instead of Ibercorum.
Mm-hmm.
Same place, okay,
Yeah.
but the Romans didn't call it York, you know. They called it Ibercorum, but it's still the same place. So that was one of the first things I started writing about, is the direct equivalence here between real history and the biblical story.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that the biblical story comes out of this as being 90% correct,
Mm-hmm.
accepting that the Israelites weren't slaves. They were powerful pharaohs of Egypt. And they still managed to get thrown out of Egypt after this civil revolt. Not too unlikely, because I view this as being a controlling authority. So if you can imagine the British Raj, when Britain took over India, and Britain ruled India for a couple of centuries, but we only ruled India with 100,000 people. And the population of India at that time was probably, I don't know, about 100 million people or something.
Mm.
But we only had about 100,000 people there to take control of the whole of India. And so as a controlling authority, you are always sort of dependent upon the local population.
Yeah.
The goodwill, as it were, of the local population. And if they want to eventually throw you out, they can do so.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what happened to the British Raj. And the British got thrown out of India, despite being the controlling authority with all of the modern weaponry that India did not have.
Mm.
Same with the Hyksos. They were a controlling authority that had all of the modern weaponry. They had the composite bow, they had the chariot, they had many things that the Egyptians didn't have. But eventually they still managed to get thrown out of the country.
Mm.
So that changes the story in that fashion as well, that, you know, these were not slaves in Egypt. These were a controlling elite, a technological elite, and they still were thrown out of the country and had to find other places to go to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they did. And they spread their technology around the Mediterranean basin. This is why a lot of the remote islands in the Mediterranean became bases for metallurgy and glass and various other things, because that technology had come out of Egypt with the Exodus.
Okay.
And so the biblical story is correct, excepting, well, you know, disregarding the theological elements, the spiritual elements of it. You know, it wasn't God that was causing the plagues; it was Santorini.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israelites, as I said before, were not slaves in Egypt. They were a controlling authority. Apart from that, the story's the same.
Mm-hmm.
So the characters are the same, the events are the same, the repercussions are the same. The Israelites were Hyksos. That's why there is a Hyksos pharaoh called Jacob.
Yeah.
Jacobam. In fact, there was two of them. There was a Hyksos pharaoh called Mamre or Abram. There is a lot of similarities. I go through the list of the Hyksos pharaohs, and you know, give or take a few mispronunciations, they are virtually the same as the ancestors of Jacob and Abraham. If you look through the king lists, as it were, but they weren't called kings within the biblical story, the patriarchs.
Yeah.
They have the same names as the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt.
Yeah, there's way too many data points correlating there for me to dismiss that as coincidence.
Yeah, but I still get these critics, and not just simply religious critics, which you might expect it from religious critics. They've only got one story to sell, you know, and if someone undermines it, they get a bit upset by it. But I've got a lot of, dare I say, better informed critics who are supposed to be historians, who are very critical, and they will say things like, well, you can't just compare the names of two people like Jacob and therefore say they are the same people. And I'm thinking, well, have you read my books? This is not a simple correlation of, two names of two different people who happen to have a similar names. It's much deeper than that. We have so many events that all correlate between these two stories, and they correlate in the same fashion, so that they're not separate events that have been jumbled together. They correlate and give the same story. So the plagues happened before the political dispute, before the Exodus, and so on. It all flows in the same manner between these two stories. These are deep and complex comparisons between the historical and the biblical story. I mean, I've written, I don't know how much I've written, actually. I mean, a lot of my books are like 500 pages long. So I've probably written in the realms of 3,500 pages on this. It's deep, it's well researched. I wouldn't say complex, because that makes it sound as if it's difficult to understand. I mean, these concepts are not difficult to understand. There are no very deep linguistics within it or things of that nature. It's all pretty obvious if you are broad-minded enough to just accept the unusual, if that's what comes out of the melting pot. Like accepting that the patriarchs were pharaohs. But I mean, the biblical story says that anyway, if you are in any way reading it with an open mind. I mean, little things like Abraham within the biblical story. So Abraham was one of the patriarchs. Abraham was a shepherd. Yeah, well, that's how they like to portray them, of course. But Abraham was a shepherd who had 318 servants.
Not just any shepherd.
Yeah, if you go around the Welsh hills or down in New Zealand, you don't really find many shepherds down there with 318 servants. So, if you're broad-minded, if you're a bit logical, that will give you the clue that something is a little bit wrong here. And then you read Josephus, because, as I say, Josephus writes the same story. He writes his own version of the Old Testament. But it's a better version, in my view, because his version came from the original Torah from the Temple of Jerusalem when it was destroyed in AD 70. Okay. So he has a much older Torah than we do now. And I think the original one might have been written in a more secular fashion, because that's how his reads. It doesn't read like, it reads like history. It doesn't read like the Old Testament, but it's the same story. Anyway, so he gives the same story of Abraham. But Josephus says that Abraham had 318 army officers. Okay, well, that changes the story somewhat. Now, if each of those army officers was a centurion, then he had a standing army of 30,000 people, 30,000 soldiers. Okay, so what sort of shepherd has a standing army of 30,000 soldiers? There is only one shepherd that would do that, and that is the shepherd pharaohs of Egypt, the Hyksos, because they had the biggest army in the whole of Egypt, in the whole of the world at that time. Yeah, okay, so Abraham was a Hyksos pharaoh of Egypt. It's pretty obvious if you've got an open mind and you don't mind change, not the reality of this story, but just the import of this story. Because again, it means that these were very powerful people indulging in powerful political games and powerful wars between entire civilizations.
Yeah.
So not just a few slaves at the mercy of the evil Egyptians who threw them out. No, this was a civil war between two very powerful dynasties. And one of them lost and got thrown out.
Yeah, there's a few things. So at what point do you know how was it? I mean, what can you say about the process of turning the Hyksos kings or pharaohs into these poor, downtrodden sort of slaves? How did we end up there?
Um, Two reasons. The first reason is that this was written in the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were slaves taken to Babylon. This was by Nebuchadnezzar. So they were in Israel. So if we're talking about the Hyksos Exodus, we're talking about 1580 BC. Thrown out of Egypt, came back to Egypt with the Joseph story. We'll go through that in a minute. Thrown out of Egypt for a second time, sort of, mostly, came back into Egypt for a second time with the Sea People invasion. The United Monarchy was in Egypt. We can go through this as well. The United Monarchy of David and Solomon. They were in Egypt in Tanis. And then the Babylonians came along. So we're now talking 600 BC. So we've moved on 1,000 years of history here. And they got thrown out again. They got thrown out of both Egypt. I think there was more of them in Egypt than Israel at the time, because at that time they were in control of the whole of the Levant. So they were the kings of Judea and Israel, but also Lower Egypt during the United Monarchy era. But in 600 BC, I think their main base would still be in Lower Egypt. But the Babylonians came along, they invaded Judea, they invaded Egypt, and they took these people into slavery in Babylon. That's the Babylonian exile, the very famous, by the rivers of Babylon. The famous song where we sat down, how do we sing a song while you're in slavery? They were taken as slaves into Babylon, and the texts were being written during the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
So now everything that was Egyptian was, I don't know, a figure of hatred.
Yeah.
It was the evil Egyptians. That was the fault. That's why we've been thrown out of our country. Why we're sitting here in Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon in exile. Someone had to be to blame for this, and of course the idea of the persecution complex is a very powerful motivation for keeping people together. We have to stay together as a group because we're being persecuted by these evil people, the evil Egyptians, the evil Babylonians, and we've got to stay together. That's the only way we can survive. And I think that's the reason why it was crafted in that fashion. They needed to craft a story of persecution, that we were the persecuted people. And then you whisper, yeah, but David and Solomon were the most powerful kings in the whole of the region. Oh, no. We were still the persecuted people. Yeah, but Abraham had an army of 30,000 men. No. We were still the persecuted people. And that, I think, is the motivation for why they crafted this story in this fashion. Because if you read the story, that's not actually how it reads in reality. It's been gently molded into the story that we have today, which is why people have to deny this, because they're still living in that persecution complex era. You look at Israel today, their whole ethos is based upon, not undeservingly, I would have to say, but upon a persecution complex.
Yeah.
Because everybody in the region that surrounds them is trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. Quite demonstrably so, with the Yom Kippur War and the 6-Day War and the previous war before that. Justifiably, they still think that everybody is against them. And that is a powerful motivating force for keeping people together. And it still is today, as it was then. So that is the reason why this book has been crafted in this fashion. You see this a little bit with the New Testament story with the Jesus character again. We'll come on to this in a minute. Again, they redesign the story with this character as a persecuted minority again. You know, the poor old Jesus. He was only a poor peacenik, poor carpenter, being persecuted by these horrible Romans and these terrible Jews. Again, it's the same idea, you know, the persecution complex. And then, you know, even later on, you know, all of the persecution of the Christians in the early centuries up until the Constantine, I suppose, 4th century, when Christianity, you know, came onto the world stage. It was all about the persecution complex again. That's the way we keep our people together. So yeah, that is the story of the early Israelites. They were actually very powerful people. They were the Hyksos. They were a very literate people. They wrote everything down. That's why we still have the Bible, because they liked to write everything down. The Bible itself was the day book of the pharaohs. So the pharaohs used to keep a day book, which is just like a diary, basically, of all of the events within the royal court, whether they be petty and domestic or whether they be international politics, you know, of the era. Everything was written down at the time. And all of the records were kept in the White House, which was the palace of the king, was known as the White House. So that hasn't changed either.
No.
And that was the book that we have. It's a record of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. And they were very, as I say, highly technological people as well. The mathematical papyrus from Egypt, which has a lot of standard math that we use today, it's a Hyksos document. So yeah, a highly educated, highly literate people. And that is the Exodus event. Now, they came back into Egypt again because, you know, Egypt was a powerful place. It had everything that you needed for a big empire. Plus, there was, you know, we've been kicked out of our country, so we want to take it back, I imagine. So they came back into Egypt under the Joseph story. This is why we have the Joseph story about him being taken back into Egypt. And of course, they have to portray it again as poor starving shepherds and all the rest of it, with poor old Jacob being left alone in Egypt, and then being molested by the high priest of On's wife and all the rest of it. Lovely little story. That's an old story that comes out of Egypt, actually. That's been portrayed in many different texts, in different versions. But we know that this is about the Hyksos people again, because we have this wonderful dialogue between Joseph and his brothers and Pharaoh. And this is what I like about this story, because if we take this as history instead of being pure mythology, here we have an exact copy of a conversation between Joseph and Pharaoh that has lasted for 3,300 years or so. It's come down to us through 3,400 maybe years of history, and we have this verbatim conversation between these two people. How do we know that this is probably correct and talking about the Hyksos? Well, because Joseph wants to bring his brothers and his family down into Egypt, and they have to go and meet Pharaoh. Okay, well, that tells you that these are important people for starters. You know, if I go to France or Italy, I don't go and see the president. You know, I just go to a hotel. You know, you're not introduced to the Pharaoh unless you are important people. Anyway, so Joseph says to his brothers, "You're going to meet Pharaoh, but don't tell him that you are shepherds. Say instead that you are cattle breeders. Your fathers and forefathers have all been cattle breeders, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, and you will not be allowed to stay in the lands of Egypt. Okay. Now that's portrayed, of course, in terms of agriculture within the biblical story, and that's how it's interpreted by theologians and even historians who seem a little bit brain dead, but there we go. But of course, it's got nothing to do with agriculture. It's to do with the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, who are known as shepherds, and the previous regime of Egypt, who were known as cattle breeders, you might say. They venerated the Apis bull.
Yeah.
A little bit of explanation necessary here. This is all to do with the precession of the equinox. Will your viewers be familiar?
Some will, some won't. Let's maybe can you give us a nutshell?
Yeah, I can give a 2-minute explanation of the precession of the equinox, because this runs through the biblical story and many other stories within this era.
Yeah, it does.
The Earth wobbles on its axis. So this is real astronomy. It's not astrology as such. The Earth wobbles on its axis, and it has this big, long wobble, which is 26,000 years, roughly. And in doing so, the constellations change. The constellation at the rising of the sun at the spring equinox will change every 2,200 years, roughly. Some constellations are bigger than others. And so we had we call these great months. So the big circle, 26,000 years, that's the great year. So we have our normal year, we have the great year. We have the normal month and the great month. And the great month is roughly 2,200 years. So we had the great month of Taurus, which ran from 4,500 BC down to 1750 BC. Then we went into Aries, which is, the great month of Aries, 1750 BC to about AD 10. And at AD 10, we went into Pisces. That's why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men, because they were following the precession of the equinox. And we zeroed our date. So, we are in 2023, not from the birth of Jesus. This is 2023 from the start of the great month of Pisces. So this is astrological. It's not really to do with Jesus. Same in 1750 BC. They went from Taurus to Aries. That's why the shepherd Hyksos pharaohs were known as shepherds. They followed Aries. It's all to do with the precession of the equinox. And this is what Joseph was talking about. So Joseph was saying to his brothers, when you meet Pharaoh, don't say that you are don't say that you are sheep venerators for the great month of, I'm going to have to go downstairs. Is that all right, just for 2 minutes? Can you
go for it.
Make a break?
No worries.
So what Joseph was saying is nothing to do with agriculture. What he was saying is, when you meet Pharaoh, don't say that you are shepherds, followers and venerators of the great month of Aries. Say instead that you are bull worshippers, worshipping the Apis bull of Egypt, which was, part of the great month of Taurus. And that also, of course, is linked to the Hyksos. So he was saying, don't say to Pharaoh that you are Hyksos shepherds. Say instead that you are venerators of the Apis bull, because the Hyksos shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. Well, of course they were, because only a few centuries before this time, they'd have a civil war with these people, which obviously cost, probably hundreds of thousands of lives, enormous disruption within Egypt. So of course the Hyksos shepherds were still an abomination to the Egyptians. That's what they were talking about. And if that's the case, if my interpretation of this is correct, then that means that this is, well, firstly, it makes sense. Before, in agricultural terms, it made no sense whatsoever. But now in astrological and political terms, it makes perfect sense. We're talking about the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. But it also probably means that this is a verbatim conversation between Pharaoh and Joseph, which, as I say, is 3,300 years old or more, has come down to us through this text into the modern era. And that's interesting, because if that is true, then that shows that this story has great veracity, that it's probably, if that can be correct in its minor detail, that someone has recorded this and it's gone down through 3 millennia or more and is still recognizably has the correct meaning to it, then quite possibly a lot of other things within the Old Testament also are historically correct. You know, if you can get a conversation correct, then you can get the broader history correct within your chronicle. And I think that's true. I think that's what they've done. So they have a full and proper history of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt.
It's interesting because, you know, that it sounds so plausible. I mean, to me, this is such a rational approach to take, and yet, you know, so many people who are wedded to the theology can't entertain these ideas, and they can't even consider the concept that there is this kernel of truth, or this core of historical something did happen, but it's also been, you know, imbued with all this sort of supernatural, theological, spiritual stuff along the way, and been edited, and you know, we call it spin or propaganda these days. You know, I mean, I think it just makes too much sense.
It does. I mean, it makes sense, and there's a lot of material within the Bible that we're not actually taught about. And so you can't actually make your own mind up about this, because most people don't even know the information to start with. I mean, there are a number of elements within the Old Testament which are purely Egyptian. Psalm 104, for instance, is the hymn to the Aten. Hymn to the Aten, for people who don't know, is a hymn written by Pharaoh Akhenaten to celebrate the dawning of a new day. And that is in the Bible. That's at Psalm 104. And you think, well, okay, well, that's interesting. It sort of links us much closer to the Egyptian story. And if we come on to, just very quickly, the united monarchy. So we have the Exodus, we have the coming back into Egypt via the Joseph story, which is then linked to Akhenaten. I wonder if we should go through that first. We'll probably come back to that. So that's linked to Akhenaten and the second Exodus, because there were 2 Exoduses out of Egypt, according to Manetho, who's the Egyptian historian from the 3rd century BC. There were 2 Exoduses. There was the great Exodus of the Hyksos, and then the smaller Exodus, which was quite obviously linked to Pharaoh Akhenaten. And so they went on an Exodus. So there was another Exodus out, but I'm not sure that all of them actually left Egypt at that point. They may have just gone in further, deeper into the Nile Delta. Because then we have a dynasty set up in the Nile Delta at Tanis. And that, I think, is the united monarchy.
Okay, so David and Solomon?
David and Solomon, because we have this same old conundrum again, that these people are missing from the historical record. And so we're back to the same old problem, you know. Is this mythology, as a lot of people would have it, or is there a historical truth to this? Now, when they've done the archaeology, there was a lot of archaeology has been done in Israel and Jerusalem by Finkelstein and Silberman, and they drew a blank. They said that at this time, we're talking about the 10th century now, we've moved on 600, 600 years or more. Jerusalem was no more than a village. And that doesn't equate with the story from Kings and Chronicles at all. They portray David and Solomon as being the most powerful kings in that region at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But the archaeology says, no, there was no such dynasty. There was only a village there in Jerusalem at that time. So what happened? You know, again, you've got these two choices. Either it's mythology, or perhaps we're looking in the wrong era, perhaps, or the wrong location. Well, with the Exodus story, we were looking in the wrong era. For this, I think we're looking in the wrong region, because I don't think they were actually in Jerusalem. I think they were in Tanis.
Okay.
So they weren't in Zion, they were in Zoan.
Okay.
A very similar title for this capital city. And Zoan was the capital city of the 21st dynasty of Egypt, who again were sort of like invading monarchy. They came into the region and took over Lower Egypt. Very familiar story. And they just happen to have a number of similarities with the biblical story.
Mm-hmm.
So where should we start this? Well, the first thing I looked for was, because you're not necessarily always going to get the same names, although we did end up with the same names, so that was interesting. So what I started looking for initially was a king that was associated with a star and a city. We all know from the biblical story that David was linked, you know, the Star of David and the city of David. He was linked to a star and a city. And I happened to be browsing the king lists of Egypt, as you do, you know, if you have an interest in these topics. And it stood out immediately that there was a king who was known for his star and his city.
Okay.
And that's Pasiba Kahayanet. And his name means my star rises in my city.
Mm-hmm.
And in his hieroglyphs, he has the star and the city glyph.
If you want to do a screen share, feel free.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. I was going to do a quick screen share. If it will do it.
Yeah, you see the button down the bottom?
Yeah, because every time I go on a talk, it's a different system.
Yeah.
So we're on Zoom this time, and
down the bottom, middle of the screen, and it's a green one.
There we go, share screen. Oh. Host has disabled it. You've got to enable your end.
Hang on a second. Let me see. One participant can share at a time. Here we go. Who can share? Here we go. Okay, now it should work for you.
Okay. So we'll try that again. Yep, that has come up. And then it says, what do you want to share? And we want that one, I think. So if we share that.
Okay.
Let's just make that a little bit bigger. That's Pasiba Kahayanet. So can you see my cursor?
Yeah, I can.
Let me see if I can make my cursor a little bit bigger. So I'm just playing around with the system preferences.
No, no problem.
Okay, so it doesn't actually make it that much bigger. Anyway, you can see the duck.
Yep.
That is Pa. And then we get the star, which is Seba or Sheba. Now that's interesting. So who's the queen of Sheba? She is the queen of the stars. So her formal title, because she came out of Egypt, we might go through this in a minute. The Queen of Sheba means the Queen of the Stars, therefore she is the Queen of Heaven. So it's quite obvious that she was an incarnation of Isis, the Egyptian goddess Isis, who was the Queen of Heaven. Anyway, that's beside the point. So Pa is the sunrise, basically, over the horizon. En Nuit. Nuit is the city glyph. So we get the star and the city glyph. And this cartouche of the king was stamped on all of the mud bricks that made the city of Tanis. So yes, everyone would have known star and city on every single brick in the whole of the city. And so, yeah, we do have a king who is known for his star and his city. And that's Parsiba Kahayanit, who's known in the Greek. So if you look it up in a wiki or something, he's called Susens, Susens II. So we do have a king who has some similarities with the David character. And of course, the name sounds different, but you can pronounce Seba in two fashions. Seba means star, but so does Duat. So his name could have been pronounced Paduat Kahana. And of course, Duat is the name of King David. He was called Duat in the Aramaic, Hebrew. So there is an equivalence there. A lot of, well, same as most language, but a lot of Egyptian words had two words meaning the same thing, and that's just one of them. And this king, Susens, lived in Zoan, not Zion, but Zoan. And so we have, if we go through his dynasty, we get a number of similarities. So this is a list, a king list and a patriarch list of 21st dynasty and the biblical ancestors of King David. So from the Bible, we get Ezron, and in the historical king list, we get Ezram or Ramesses. So Ezron and Ramesses. Then we get Ram and Ramesses. So there is a patriarch, there's a biblical patriarch called Ram, who is an ancestor of King David. And these are in the order that they're given within the biblical story. So I'm not even really changing the order here.
That's important.
Yeah. And then from the Bible, we get Aminadab. And from history, we get Amen Nazbanejed. So it's if we just knock out the middle bit, we get Aminadab, Amenabjed. Same name. Sounds similar. Then from the Bible, we get Nashon. From history, we get Neshu. Nashon, Neshu. Then again, biblical, we get Salmon. And history, we get Siamun. Salmon, Siamun. And then history, biblical, we get Boaz, the famous Boaz of the, the twin pillars. And from history, we get Buas Orkan. Boaz, Buas. And then from the biblical record, we get Obed, and we get Amenemopet. So we get Obed and Opet. So we get two dynasties. I mean, and these two dynasties lived at the same time. They're both 10th century BC. And they lived in a fairly similar location. One lived in Zoan, the other lived in Zion. Are they the same? Well, it's looking a little bit like that. But then when I started looking at the immediate family around King David, it seemed even closer. So if we look at the daughter of King David,
you'll find the full video and any bonus materials in my exclusive members-only portal, The Truthiversity. This unique creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, courses, articles, videos, audio files, the whole enchilada. Book your spot at truthiversity.com.